Have you ever come home from a shoot and realized that you messed it all up?
This week, we'll share a few things that we wish we knew sooner so it doesn't happen to you.
It's actually been a little while since we've done our last show because you, Glenn, have disappeared into the South American jungle for a few weeks. What did you actually do there? Were you hiding? What's going on?
Well, first of all, it was more than a few weeks, Jan. I was actually gone for 8 weeks. 8 weeks is a long time to be away from home. Definitely was a long photo trip. But I was working. I was guiding 2 tours in Colombia and then 1 tour in Ecuador. And in between the tours, I had a few days to myself to go off and chase a few special birds here and there. So it was really fun, really productive couple of months, but definitely a long time to be away from home.
See, there's one thing I always wonder if people lead workshops and they often go back to kind of similar places, right? Like you go to the place year and year again, and then you always have different people with you. I'm sure there's some people you might enjoy the company a little bit more than others. How does it actually feel like being away from home for so long and kind of grinding it out at times? And what is it like to go back to like the same spot somewhat over and over?
Definitely there's some places where you go back to and I don't even bother pulling out my camera because, I've probably literally photographed that same exact toucan before. But I do find that especially my Colombia tours, it's so dynamic and the sort of ecotourism, the bird tourism is constantly changing. So going back to the same sites, it's almost like there's always something new. Like as an example, one of the sites we go to that's been a really fun place they have some ant pittas that they feed and some toucans and different things. But this year on one of the tours I was doing, like I said, I was doing 2. The first tour I went and they were like, oh, we have a new bird that's coming in to eat little worms. And they had this beautiful yellow-breasted chat tyrant that was coming in. And then I went back 2.5 weeks later with my second group and the guy was like, oh, we have a new bird. And I was like, no, I know about the chat tyrant. He's like, no, a new one. So even 2 weeks later, they started feeding these little mountain wrens at the same site. So things are always dynamic and changing, especially in Colombia. Really exciting place to visit for bird photographers.
And so on the personal level, like what does it be like to meet so many different people all the time, be away from your own home for so long, and essentially be by yourself down there as well, right? Like you are with other people, but there will be a lot of times where you're just by yourself in the hotel room.
I feel really lucky that my first group in Colombia was a bunch of clients that have traveled with me quite a lot in the past to other destinations. So it's actually like seeing old friends.
Yeah, that's good.
And a really good group dynamic and vibe and everything. Don't tell anyone, but it doesn't even really feel like working sometimes. But of course, then there's other times when, especially, towards the end of a long trip like this, where you're like, let's be honest, you're ready to get home. I mean, you've been away from your family for a long time, your house, your routines. For me, I always struggled just not being able to exercise. It sounds like a trivial little thing, but I'm just at home. I'm so used to exercising and doing things, and then I'm on the road and I don't have my little routines and things like that. So it has all its ups and downs. Overall, I love my job. I would not trade it. I felt actually really good throughout this whole trip. The worst was just the trip home. I had to get up at 1:30 in the morning to go catch a flight from Quito to Bogota, Bogota, Toronto, Toronto, Vancouver, Vancouver, Victoria. And by the time I got home, I was awake for 28 hours. And I don't know, I must be getting old because I was exhausted.
Well, it sounds like you had some good times and some bad times. You already mentioned some birds, but were there some sort of highlights? Did you get some new birds for yourself that you were excited about?
In 2 months in the Andes, if you didn't find some good birds, you're doing something wrong for sure. We got some fantastic shots of the chestnut-breasted chloriphonia, which is a stunning little bird that I'd never had any success with before. The gold-ringed tanager was another really beautiful one that we spotted there. There was a lot of little birds like that I've seen a bunch of times, but several that I got my best shots of on this particular trip, like the red-bellied grackle was another good one. One of the other sites started feeding these amazing black-collared jays, which don't go to feeders anywhere else in the world, so that was a really cool opportunity. These crimson-mantled woodpeckers came in and just hit this absolutely amazing perch, and he was just proudly sitting up there. Perfect background, amazing perch, one of the most spectacular woodpeckers in the world. 15 years I've been photographing birds in South America. That was by far the best opportunity I've ever seen with these birds.
That's definitely a crazy looking bird. And I know with birds that are colored, like bright red especially, it's always very hard to get any sort of details in the red. And just in general, what did you do to the image and how did you make it look so good?
Definitely started with just doing some noise reduction on the bird. I always like to run my files through DXO Pure RAW, and then into Adobe Camera Raw. And the first step for me, of course, is to apply one of our ProSets. On this one, even though it's a red bird, and there definitely could have been some options to use some of the ones from our reds pack, but I actually just used the Vibrant More Contrast, which is kind of my go-to
Yeah,
ProSet.
same.
That made it look right away better out of the gate. And then I did my normal workflow that I work through all these steps of, adjusting the levels and the saturation and things like that. But one thing that was really needed, and this is where actually our brush pack came in hugely helpful, was this bird had some of the red feathers that weren't quite really red. And you could just tell that the bird maybe had molted a little bit, or just a few feathers hadn't quite got the pigment in them. And so I went through with our adding color to dull feathers brush and added a little bit more of that red into the red feathers. And then I also used the brush pack to add some saturation to the yellows as well. So between just those selective edits using our brush pack that made it so easy, I was able to get this result as the final picture, which I think I'm really happy with this photo.
And it's good to see that the ProSets seem to work so well on such a bright red bird as well, because oftentimes if you use other profiles, either it doesn't look red at all, or it's basically red without any detail in it. So it's definitely good to see that they work. And if you guys want to do one-click raw editing, transform your raw files, then make sure to check out the ProSets and the brush pack down there in the description.
We've talked about this on the show in the past, where you see images online on Facebook or eBird or somewhere, and there was a couple of pretty rare and skulky birds that I saw from the same location. And I was like, oh man, next time I go to Colombia, I think I'm going to go down there. It's this beautiful hooded ant pitta, the smallest little ant pitta in the world, and also a species of ant thrush, the Schwartz's ant thrush. So I was really excited to go try to photograph these birds. So I made plans to fly down and go and check out this area. First day I went to the site and, I did this great setup for them. And I sat there and I stared at my branch for 5 hours. Not one bird came in. Not one bird. Nothing. No common birds, no rare birds, nothing. I just sat there staring at this thing. And eventually I just said, okay, I'm calling it. And I went back down to the lodge. The second day could not have been more different. I went back up. Now, it might have been because I had been setting up these perches, and maybe the birds that are kind of shy, reclusive birds, I spent a little bit too much time around. The second day, I got back there straight into the hide, and I just sat there, and within 5 minutes, 3 different species of skulking birds, the hooded ant pitta, the white-bellied ant pitta, and the Schwartz's ant thrush. Sometimes both of them were there at the same time. So the difference couldn't have been more stark, and I think there's a lesson to be learned there. The first day was basically a disaster. 5 hours, 0 photos. The second day, the conditions were perfect. The light was good. The birds all came right away. So what a difference a day makes. And I think we have to remember that sometimes if you don't succeed in one endeavor, try again, because sometimes a day later can be a totally different story.
I actually had quite a similar experience to you on my not so recent road trip anymore, but for you and I, it's actually quite recent because the last time we talked was literally in December. So I was driving down from the Sunshine Coast to Melbourne in December, and I really wanted to photograph these beautiful little turquoise parrots. And for years, I'd always tried to photograph a male, and I could never get quite a shot. There's certain birds you try and you try and you try, and you just can't get a photo of them.
The old nemesis bird.
Yeah, definitely. And you guys can let us know in the comments what your nemesis bird is as well. So for me, it's definitely a male turquoise parrot. And I actually texted a friend of mine, and he has a lot of turquoise parrots breeding on his property. So he collects all these cool looking logs and places them all over his property. And over the years, more and more of these birds have started breeding there. So it's pretty awesome. And in terms of photography, it's very good as well because it's quite low, basically eye level. You have nice light and you have a nice background. So everything seemed to align very well, and there was one nest left that actually had quite large babies. And what's great about that sort of larger baby is that they then climb up to the top of the nest when the parents come in to feed them. So I was able to get some really cool photos of the female feeding the babies. The only problem was that it turned out that the male of the nest had disappeared. He was probably eaten by a predator or something. So I'm like, oh, that's my luck. Now I have the perfect nest, the perfect opportunity. The babies are climbing up, but the male is dead. But I didn't want to give up, so any moment I had there, I spent at that nest, I think 3 or 4 days in a row, hidden away so I wasn't affecting the birds. And then on the very last day, for some reason, I got there a bit early, and for about 2 seconds, a different pair of parrots landed on the nest to just check out the babies randomly. and the babies already had their head up, and so the male just landed next to the babies, and I was able to get one really nice shot with like 4 babies sticking out the head and a male, even though it was not the actual father of the babies, but I still got a shot with the male and the babies. So
Nobody will
that
know.
was really nice how it all came together in the end. I guess it's the same story, right? You just try again, try again, try again, and eventually you might get lucky.
There's no doubt about it. The more time you spend in the field, the more you'll get lucky, if that's what you can even call it. But it's just the reality is you just have more opportunities, and those are some awesome shots that I'm sure you'll definitely remember and will probably be one of your favorites for a long time to come, I would imagine.
Oh, definitely.
Well, even that wasn't on our list, Jan, of things we wish we knew sooner. I think that is actually our bonus tip, number 6. Things we wish we knew sooner is that sometimes you have to try, and try again to get the shot. But we did prepare a list of 5 things we wish we knew sooner. So Jan, what's your first thing that you wish as a bird photographer you wish you knew sooner?
I think one of the most important things in bird photography is actually to use a high enough shutter speed and to make sure that you nail your exposure. Those two really go together. And I guess the third part of that is as well to not use too low ISOs. When we start out, we're always being taught use low ISOs, you have image stabilization, you can kind of get away with using low shutter speeds handheld, but that's usually a recipe for disaster, especially when you're shooting handheld, even with great image stabilization. First of all, we are shaking, but what people always forget is that the subject we're photographing can also move quite quickly. And even if a bird, for instance, is sitting down quite slowly, it's not doing anything, you never really know if it's not going to do something crazy, suddenly rip up the wings, or another bird comes in the tree nearby and it starts to maybe display or starts to show some aggressive behavior, or maybe it starts singing. And if we have dialed in a too slow shutter speed, it will just happen that a lot of times our shots will just turn out blurry.
What I see a lot is where people really want to use a fast shutter speed, but then they don't actually, for example, if you're shooting manual, they just wind up underexposing a bunch of the images because they want the fast shutter speed, but they don't want to raise the ISO. And so they ultimately wind up with just a raw file that's too dark. And that is not a good strategy. You always want to expose the scene properly. If you have to raise the ISO, raise the ISO. But I always say that you need an adequate shutter speed, because there are sometimes, like for example, I was just talking about with the ant pittas, these birds sit so still. When they come in, they hop, 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 and they freeze. I mean, they absolutely freeze. And they're very consistent in that movement. You're not going to get a flight shot of an ant pitta. You're not going for that dynamic shot. So in that situation, knowing the behavior of the bird and knowing that you can get away with a 50th of a second and you don't need to shoot at ISO 12,800, because also in this situation, you're going to be shooting in the dark rainforest. So if you went for like a 500th of a second on these ant pitta shoots, forget it. You're going to be shooting at ISO 64 billion. You're not going to get a reasonable shot. So sometimes you have to know what is the adequate shutter speed for what you're trying to capture, and you have to expose the scene properly.
Now, I think that's a good point. If you know that nothing will happen, the bird's just going to sit there, you're on a tripod, you can try some slow exposures. But if you're not sure, I think erring on the side of caution, using a high ISO that you can still denoise later, and then having a decent enough shutter speed definitely makes sense.
Absolutely. And this, we're going to touch on this in another one of our points here. But for example, you can, of course, start at a higher ISO, nail some shots, and then you think, okay, I got it at ISO 12,800. Now I'm going to risk going to 6,400, and then you can do it that way. But that's a good strategy for sure. Okay, let's move on to our second thing we wish we knew sooner. And I think the one I'm going to pick from our list here is a kind of a simple one, but I think it's something that a lot of people don't really do, which is to spend time shooting with other photographers, either that you admire or people that you just know in your area. Maybe it's somebody who has more experience than you. Maybe it's somebody who has a different style than you, but definitely spending time with other photographers to inspire you, to learn from, and to make yourself a better photographer is something that I think everybody should consider.
It's sometimes easier said than done, because it's not always easy or comfortable to reach out to other people. But for instance, you can go on the workshops. I remember back in 2007, I went to Ellen Murphy's first ever workshop, and that was someone that I really admired back then. To this day, I'm probably still benefiting from seeing their field craft and their field techniques. And there's another person that took me out back when I started out, Brian Small. He's probably watching this video as well. He took me out in Texas just for one afternoon. But even during those times, right, when you start out and just learning things, you see someone who's done it for 20 years, it just gives you some insights that are very hard to come by any other way. Like you
On
can
your own.
look at Instagram, you can look at internet forums, but you never actually see what these people do in the field when it comes to kind of
Yeah.
trying to get a bird on your perch, or just approaching different things, or just seeing things, right? I think photography is a lot of seeing things without the camera. Like you're walking along somewhere and you think, if the bird was there, that would actually be a really nice photo. Or you think, if I zoomed out here, suddenly I could include this whole nice scene. So it's a lot about seeing, but also learning from other people. And when I started out, I basically reached out to anyone that I thought was taking great photos. And not everyone said, oh yeah, I can take you out, but a surprising amount of people is actually quite happy to take you out on a day trip somewhere. And yeah, I think that's the fastest way to learn and to become better for sure.
I agree. I think that is potentially the most profound thing, is to really see firsthand how people are getting these types of shots that you like. And it could be different styles. It could be flight shooting. It could be getting birds onto perches. It could be different things. But there's sometimes are these light bulb moments when you're in the field with someone else and you're like, oh, I see how that works. And that can really level up your bird photography. So find some friends.
And well, that's actually how we met the first time, I think, as well, because
Yeah,
I think
true.
I reached out to you when I was on Vancouver Island, and then you took me to the Golden Pond and we got all these canvas backs and stuff. So it was a pretty good day as well, and how our journey sort of started.
Totally. There you go.
We touch on this topic a little bit, but it's also very important to sometimes just slow down and think about what you're doing when you're photographing. It's very easy to be caught up in just finding a bird and then just firing away, ignoring everything else. And only once the bird's gone, you realize, there was a fence post in the background, or there was a little shadow on the bird, or the bird may have sat in a beautiful scenery, but all you were doing was taking like tight portraits. And that actually happened to me many, many, many years ago when I was in northern Norway. And the birds were all in a beautiful tundra on these little flowering hills. But at that time, I was kind of just new to the big lenses, and I kind of felt like everything had to like literally touch the edge of the frame. So most of the shots I was taking were like super tight in the frame. If anything, you couldn't even crop because you'd be cropping off body parts. So now my favorite shots from the trips were the 2 or 3 shots where I actually wasn't able to get close enough to the bird, so it's a bit more scenery around it.
Yeah, I think what I see a lot of times in the tropics or where I go, you go to these lodges and people get there and they're really excited, of course, to shoot. Understandable. Beautiful birds. Everything's great. And I'm always running around, finding perches and setting stuff up. And sometimes I think the clients are like, what is this guy doing? I mean, why aren't we shooting yet? What's going on here? And then an hour or 2 hours later, they realize, like, now Glenn has set up this stage for us with these beautiful perches. The birds have gotten used to them. They're all landing. And either later that day or maybe even the next day, they look at the pictures they have and they understand. It's really important to go for a top quality shot. I think when you have the opportunity and the bird's coming to you, it's coming right to the feeder, it's landing somewhere. Taking that extra hour, slowing down. Okay, where exactly do we want the bird to be? The background's the best over there. Let's move the perch up a bit. Let's find a really good perch where we have a good background. Oh, you know what? Actually, in an hour, the light's going to be a bit better. So while we're setting up, that's always going to be good for us anyways, because the light's only going to get better. And just looking for all those important elements of the shot and making sure that when you walk away from that site, you're really happy with the images that you've created, not that you just got a sharp photo of a beautiful bird. That's not enough. That's not enough. So we have to raise our game and try to get those really top quality shots and slow down and set up for success.
And Glenn, I actually went back to one of the spots that we visited when you were in Australia as well, where we photographed these beach stone curlews. This was another interesting spot as well, because I think you were shooting with a 600mm prime lens there, and I was shooting with a zoom lens there. And it was quite interesting to see, because you can get quite different angles and perspectives when you have a zoom lens. For instance, with the prime lens, you're more sort of refined to maybe a headshot or sort of a full body portrait on the beach. Whereas with that zoom lens, you were able as well to zoom out a little bit more and just get a different perspective on things. And this is, I think, where in general a zoom lens can be quite helpful. And if you have a zoom lens, I think it definitely pays off to not only shoot it on the long end, right? You might be able to get a headshot or full body shot on the long end, but what I would recommend as well is to just sometimes slow down, think, zoom out, and you might be able to actually get some really cool shot of the bird in the habitat. So the key word here is patience as well. You don't just want to rush in, because if you want to take photos that truly stand out, it sometimes requires you to watch amazing scenes kind of pass you up for a little bit to then be able to create something unique. Or sometimes you actually can't just jump in and shoot. When I was photographing this little tern colony recently, what happened to me was you could basically only shoot the last 30 minutes of the day because there was insane heat haze coming off that sand. So I actually went there early. I thought, oh, it's great light. The babies are there. The parents are feeding them. And I started shooting. And when I actually zoomed into my photos, I couldn't even identify the babies because they were completely mushed in with the sand and the heat haze. And I had to wait a very long time, almost until after sunset sometimes, to be able to get the one opportunity of the parents coming in with the fish to feed the babies, and actually not enough heat haze to get the shot.
And I think that's a great segue, Jan, into our next thing we wish we knew sooner, which is to always verify that you actually got the shot. I've had similar experiences. Heat haze can be one of the worst ones because when you're looking through your viewfinder, everything looks great. You're like, I'm nailing it. I remember actually, funnily enough, Brian Small, you're coming up twice in this episode. I was up in Churchill years ago, and Brian and I just happened to be there at the same time, and we were off shooting, and I remember we were shooting this Pacific loon. Everything was great. The birds swimming around right in front of us. Conditions looked fantastic. And getting home and being like, these photos are all unusable. There was just some heat coming up off the water. There's nothing you could have done about it differently. But if I had not gone back another day or found another bird to photograph and I thought, oh, I got the best shots of the Pacific loon, and I just walked away, I would have gone with nothing, because verifying, and in this case, realizing that they were all garbage was really important. So you have to make sure that you got the shot while either chimping quickly while you're in the field, or each night. I really, when I'm on shoots, like to go through my images every night and make sure that things are good, because if I feel like actually, even though I in the moment thought I nailed the shot and then I'm like, not quite, I might ditch my plans that I was going to do the next day and go back to that and shoot it again if I feel like I didn't quite nail it.
Yeah, I don't necessarily download my files all the time at night, but I definitely go through the pictures on the back of the camera, and even while I'm in the field, I just quickly scroll through a series of images that I've taken, zoom into 100% and make sure that they're sharp and that the images look like the way I want them to look like. Or there might be certain birds that have a very bright spot on the head, for instance, like these pale-headed rosellas in my backyard. And if you shoot like you would normally shoot, you basically have no details in their head because everything else in your picture is kind of dark, but these heads are insanely bright. So you actually have to intentionally underexpose your images a lot more than what you would normally do to be able to maintain all the details in the bird. And if you didn't do this and you just snapped away with some shots, you might end up with a lot of ruined photos where you can't recover any details. So checking your images on the go is definitely very important.
And once again, Jan, a great segue into our final thing we wish we knew sooner, because those Rosella shots, the way you take them to have to hold on to the highlights, those images are gonna need some processing. And if you haven't invested the time and maybe the money to learn how to process your images well, I honestly think you're just wasting your time in the field. Image editing is so important, and it's a skill. It's like all kinds of skills in life. If you don't spend the time to learn how to do it well, I really feel like, I don't want to tell people that they're wasting their time. If you're having a good time out there and you're enjoying yourself, great. But you're ultimately not going to get the best possible results. The way I look at it is, you spend all this time in the field, you spend all this money on equipment, maybe money on flying around the world, and then to not take that final step to learn how to edit your photos, at least to a reasonable standard, to me, it just feels like an incomplete process. That's how I feel anyways.
Definitely, and that's why I've made some really valuable resources like my masterclass and your ebooks that we've linked down there in the description as well, because in the beginning, I had no idea what I was doing. I was opening Lightroom or Photoshop, I was ripping on some sliders, hoping something cool would happen, whereas if I had a plan, a lot of my images from earlier in the days would have looked much better. And I think that's what it's all about, creating the pictures in the field, but then also making sure that we can edit them to the best of the photo's ability, basically transforming like maybe an average photo into a fantastic looking photo.
And it's a continuum too. When you start, it's not realistic to think that you could edit a photo like Jan or I could. You have to learn the skills. Also, your vision for that raw file when it opens would be different. You would see something different than Jan or I would see. The plan that we would be having going on in our head for how we would improve the image would be different. It's a continuum. As you learn and as you get better, you have more skills, you have more options. we're here to hopefully try to inspire people to get better photos and to learn how to get better bird images. And if you're not spending time improving your skills in the digital darkroom, you probably should be.
But of course, we don't only want to talk about how important editing is, we also want to give you hands-on tip that you can use in your own editing process. So it's time for the editing tip of the week.
Oh, wait. We've got a new name. It's no longer called the editing tip of the week. Thanks to your guys' suggestions in the comments of one of our last videos, we picked a new name for this segment, and it's going to be called the tweak of the week. So, Jan, what's this week's tweak of the week?
So this is actually something that I didn't know for a long time, and I think you, Glenn, actually taught me that trick. I used to think that whenever you open your RAW file in Photoshop, you put it through Camera Raw, and once you click open, you can never go back to Camera Raw and make any tweaks. But that's wrong, isn't it?
That's right. For I don't know how many generations of Photoshop now, but for quite a while now, there's actually, if you go into the filter section, there's a filter called the Camera Raw filter. And essentially it just opens up Camera Raw again. Now you're not going back to the actual RAW file. You're essentially using the interface of Camera Raw on the TIFF or PSD or DNG or whatever you're working on. But it's a really great option for sometimes certain things that you want to go back and retouch. The best thing about it though is that you can apply it as a separate layer. And that's how I tend to use the Camera Raw filter. What about you, Jan?
One thing I really like to do is to go into the filter section and then use the gradient filter. Because sometimes we just feel like the background in our images is a little bit boring, or it'd be nice if maybe a certain background area would be a little bit brighter. So you can go in, create a new layer, then go to the Camera Raw filter, go to the filters and create a gradient filter on the background. So the big advantage now to doing this in Photoshop versus doing this in the beginning of your RAW conversion is that now I have all these changes on a separate layer. So it's very easy with the layer mask to brush this in and off my subject. And because the masks are a bit more refined in Photoshop, it also won't give you a transition on your subject. So for instance, I can now brighten the corner of my image without really brightening the bird. And this is something I use in my images from time to time just to give a little bit of a different feel in the images.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways you can use this technique that we're talking about. Some that come to mind that I use fairly often. Sometimes you get deeper into your editing and then you realize, for example, maybe the background is cooler than you'd like it to be or warmer than you'd like it to be in the bird. And I find that a really easy thing to adjust using this. So make a new layer, filter, Camera Raw filter, and then you can adjust the entire warmth of the image, for example. So let's just say, for example, that we wanted the bird to be warmer. So you make the image a little bit warmer, and then you go back. Now you've made the whole image brighter, or warmer, I should say. All you need to do is make a selection, select subject, and then you can just mask it out of the background, and only the bird will have gotten warmer. So you have this great creative control, all of the power of selections of Photoshop, of layer masking, and all of the tools of the Camera Raw. So specific color edits or temperature edits can be really easily handled even later on if you didn't get it perfect out of the gate in Adobe Camera Raw.
Because you can do most of these things with adjustment layers as well, but I always find it more difficult, for instance, to use color balance to adjust the warmth on an image. Whereas if you go into the Camera Raw filter, you have the white balance slider, and it's actually quite nice and easy to just make it a little bit warmer. You can do it with other tools, but I always find the Camera Raw filter to be very easy to use and very handy.
Yeah. Another one I'll just mention really quickly. It's a new feature of Photoshop, and in the color section of Adobe Camera Raw, there's a point color. And if you have a specific color in your image that's kind of tricky, you can select that color and I can adjust the hue, saturation, and luminance of that very specific color. It's much more specific than when you go into the hue saturation adjustment. So that can be another fun, interesting way you can use this. But I think the idea overall is you can do a lot of stuff with the Camera Raw filter. And by using it in a later stage of your workflow where you can incorporate selections, layers, and layer masking, you have even more control in your final image edit.
Definitely, there's just one little word of warning when you use the point color, because it will adjust the color all throughout your image. So if you have the color only in a certain part of the image, is fine. But for instance, if the color shows up in your background as well and you do a more dramatic change, you might get a lot of harsh banding in your background. So you have to be very careful that that color is really only in the area that you want to adjust, because you can try it. Otherwise, you slide it around and suddenly your background just breaks up completely. So a little bit caution there, but it can definitely be super handy.
And of course, if that did happen, you could simply mask that out of the background and have it only applied to the bird and not the background. So like we said, you have so much control to use this tool. So try it out on your next image edits, and it might be a nice new tool to have in your toolbox. So why don't we move on to this week's photo of the week?
So the first image that jumped right at me was of this yellow-eared toucanet by Wildlife Journeys CR, Costa Rica, I suppose. And they say it's one of the hardest toucanets to photograph. I'll ask you about that in a second, Glenn. But I just thought it's an amazing photo. It looks super crisp and clean. It has a decent perch. It has a nice background that kind of transitions nicely to the top. And then the bird also looks bang on, super nice editing, very crisp and clean colors. Just an all around super nice photo.
Yeah, definitely one. I've seen this bird, but I've never had an opportunity to photograph it. I've seen them up in the trees high. So this doesn't scream feeder shot to me either. I think this was somebody was in the field and got a good opportunity. Regardless, it's a beautiful shot of this species. Okay, so my first image this week is by My Birds Gallery. And I just thought this was a really fun shot of, it's probably in Florida or somewhere, I would imagine, of this purple gallinule flying right at the photographer, which sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. I think what works for me about this image is kind of got these googly eyes. It's pretty much straight on, and the wings and the feet are all very symmetrical. So I think if the wings had a bad pose or were offside or something like that. But in this case, I like the pose. I think it's a fun image, flying right at the camera, colorful, cool bird, nice background. I think this is a fun shot. What do you think, Jan?
Yes, it's definitely a nice photo, very nicely edited as well. I think, as you say, with a nice background, nice clean colors. I'm not 100% sold on the pose, but overall, it's definitely a nice shot, and it fits very nicely in that 4x5 Instagram crop too.
Yeah, I like it. I think it's a fun shot.
My next photo is from Classman photo of this fiery topaz, and I thought it's just a spectacular looking hummingbird with a nice background. I think the pose is done really well because you see all the iridescence in the throat, you see all the beautiful colors of the bird, you see that nice cool tail as well. Of course, when we're picky, the perch is probably a little bit bright and it's not the nicest perch I've ever seen. And what I would sometimes do in a situation like this, I probably use our darken brush first and just darken the perch a bit. Or you could probably also use the camera raw filter, pull back the highlights and brush that back in on its own layer. And then I would probably try to get rid of that tiny bit of branches kind of poking into the bird's butt on the right hand side. And the other thing I sometimes do with a perch like this is that I go into filters, liquefy, and I will just kind of shrink the top of the perch a bit, and then you can push it in and out and just give it a little bit more of a sort of bendy shape or something. You can't overdo this, but in terms of just shrinking the perch a little bit and giving it a little bit more shape, this can be quite good sometimes.
Yeah, well, this is a bird that's a really tough one. I mean, you don't see a lot of good photos of these birds. They're kind of a canopy dwelling hummingbird. They're usually feeding at flowering trees up in the canopy, so people see them up high. I don't think this is at a feeder. At least I don't know of any feeders where this bird comes to. I've photographed this bird's sort of cousin, closest relative, the crimson topaz, and the way that I had to photograph it was to wait at a little stream in the Amazon where they were sometimes coming down to feed on insects. And I wonder if that's what's going on here too, where this photographer maybe found a spot like a stakeout for this bird, or a guide showed them where there was a stakeout and they just waited, and you had to kind of go with what the perches were available. I wonder if that's the situation here, but beautiful bird, great pose, seeing the iridescence on the throat as well as the back, fantastic. Maybe the best photo of this species there is, because there's just not a bird you see a lot of good photos of. So nice job, Classman photo. Okay, so for my second photo this week, I went a little outside of the box here, something a little bit of a different type of image. And Mel Weber Photography from Switzerland had this really cool shot of these cranes up against the moon. I assume this was like out of the camera, not a photoshopped image. I think it's a really successful image, something totally different, a nice silhouetted pose with the moon in the background, just something really creative and not the kind of image that you see every day. So this one really jumped out at me as something quite creative and interesting. What do you think, Jan?
I think they're probably white storks on a nest, probably somewhere on the roof or on the pole. So then ideal at certain times of the year, you're probably able to position yourself in a way that the moon will rise right behind the nest.
Yeah.
So I think there's even apps these days that tell you where the moon will be in a certain time of the year or certain time of the day. So that's probably what's going on here, but it's definitely perfect timing. And I mean, it's super lucky that the storks were actually doing something with the moon behind it. Because normally they might just, especially at night, you'd think they would just kind of stand there, right? Like they wouldn't really
Yeah.
do much at night, but it's definitely a fantastic photo.
And again, this photo brings us back to our 5 things we wish we knew sooner and setting up for success, right? I mean, I highly doubt this person was just like, oh, it's the middle of the night. I think I'm just going to go snap a picture of these storks. And I think it's a very successful image. So nice job, Mel Weber.
My last image is of this pair of bearded redlings. I think it was taken somewhere in Belgium, and it's definitely a nice shot. It's nice to get both male and female on the perch, but I think this is definitely a photo that could benefit from some selective editing, because currently it's nice as it is, but it somehow feels like it's a photo of birds taken on a sort of dull, rainy day. But that's not necessarily how this photo has to look. I think with a few selective adjustments, we could definitely make the bird shine more in the overall image, make it look even more attractive and better. So what are some of the changes you think you would be doing?
Yeah, so I agree with everything you just said. I think, as you said, what is the star of this photo is the male and female birds together in a very similar pose, looking nice and cute, and they're not in each other's way. They're nicely stacked on this, nice, quite interesting perch. For me, what's not interesting in this image is these extra elements of the out of focus kind of reed and that little bit of in focus reed sticking into the corner. I'm all for extra elements in the frame. It doesn't just have to be perch, bird, background done. Having extra elements is actually extremely desirable in an image in many cases, but it has to add to the photo. It has to make the photo look more attractive or more interesting. And these I don't think do. So, surprise, surprise, I would clone them out. So I think that gets us a part of the way there to having a stronger image. The next thing I would do after cloning those out, I would then assess the crop. And I imagine that I would crop tighter given that those elements would be gone. And then I think, as you suggested, I think there's ways to enhance this image to make it look, give it a little more pop. I think you could probably go overall brighter if you did it as a separate layer and then just layer mask back the bright background back to how it currently is. So the birds and the background in the lower part get a bit brighter, not a lot, but just a little bit brighter. And the background, the white part of the background stays the same. And I think overall, that image would be a little bit stronger than the current presentation.
I think one of the issues currently is as well that you cannot see the eye of the male basically in this small photo as well. So I'd
It's
probably
lost.
work on that a little bit as well. And I think you could get away with kind of brightening the birds, especially the male's head a little bit more, and maybe adding a tiny bit more saturation. I'm actually not 100% sold on removing all the reeds on the left, because I kind of feel like they add to the image. But at the same time, I think what the problem is, they're actually too high because they're kind of right in front of the birds' faces. So one could also think about maybe moving it down or kind of cloning away just half of it. So you still have some of it in the shot, but it's not right in front of the bird's face. Because I agree, as it is right now, it kind of feels like the female is staring right into that next piece of reed, where
Into
it's
a wall.
usually nice to give it a bit more sort of flow. And maybe here's two versions. This is what Glenn was thinking, this is what I was thinking, and you can see which one you like better and let us know in the comments.
Okay, so my last image this week is of this beautiful male northern pintail. This is a bird that in the wintertime is all around where I live here on Vancouver Island. And it's just a really nice shot. The bird kind of probably after it's been putting some water on itself and it's gotten up into the water and done some little flapping to get the water off. They've captured the iridescence in the bird's head, which is really nice. A nice wing position, quite a pleasant kind of out of focus background. They had a nice calm day. Looks like they had some nice light. So overall, I just think it's a nice portrait. And this is a bird that's quite tricky to compose for because of that long tail. A lot of times when they're swimming just perpendicular to the camera, it's
Yeah.
you wind up with too much negative space. So in this case, that the fact that the bird actually kind of jacked up and that has its wings forward and its tail back, it actually allowed for quite a pleasing composition. So overall, I think it's quite a nice shot by Birds by KSW. What
And
do
I
you
was
think,
actually
Cam?
just wondering about the tail. Is this the time of the year where they have a bit of a shorter tail? Because I think when I was photographing them, especially more towards spring, they actually have an even longer tail than what this bird has now. Because I exactly remember what you were saying. You tried to frame this bird and the tail is like there and the head's there. And you're like, how am I going to make this work? You almost have to have them swim towards you so it actually fits
diagonal.
better in the frame. This full on side view that we often like, especially with ducks, it never really fully works with these ones just because the tail is so far out to the side. I think it's a really nice photo. The background colors are really nice. The only thing I think here is they may have been a little bit heavy on like the maybe lifting the shadows. I think it could definitely get away with a decent amount more contrast on the birds. I think they obviously tried to get out the colors in the wings and everything. So I think you can maintain this, but a bit more contrast on the bird would probably give it a little bit more punch, because I just feel like it has a slight sort of washed out look.
You could grab the old mid-tone contrast brush from our brush pack and just paint over the wings a little bit and maintain the shadow detail in the colorful feathers there, but add a little bit to the upper wing if you wanted to. But overall, a really nice shot. And I think with that, we're just about done with this episode of the Bird Photography Show. We hope you've enjoyed it. Let us know down in the comments if you did enjoy it. And maybe let us know one thing that you wish you knew sooner when you started your photographic journey.
So make sure to do that. Also give us a thumbs up for the video and hit that subscribe button. And we will see you guys in another episode very soon. Bye.
See you next time, guys.